Hello everybody and welcome to a different episode on this channel. As always, I like to try and keep things a bit varied and naturally, excuse me for the lighting, naturally one of the main talking points that I've had with a number of people who I've either got a classic or a modern classic or thinking of owning one is the prices and values that are around in the classic car community in general tend to be quite varied and all over the place recently. I think for the last, I'd say 6 months to even a year maybe, classic car values have gone really south recently. Mainly due to a number of reasons. The state of the UK economy in general, people are being very careful with where they put their money, and that's always the case during times of maybe a recession that technically we are in, and also just a general shift in people's behaviour and attitudes to certain generations of classic cars. We know that pre-war cars are not doing very well, and they haven't been doing very well for many years, and yet 10 years ago some of these cars were worth a fortune, probably 5 figures. Now, well, definitely 4 figures, but not even halfway through the 4 figures, to be honest. And if you want one that isn't restored, they're not worth much now because people don't want to own them because they can't drive them or can't really enjoy them, let alone something that they have to build in order to drive and restore. That's even worse. So I would say most cars pre-war that are not in a state where they could be easily recommissioned to the road, which is definitely not the case in many circumstances that I've seen, then nobody wants them. And sadly, they're going to be probably used as spares cars for other cars that are in better condition, that survive from their make and model. Anything that's just after, I'd say mid-40s to probably 1960, that 15-year gap is also suffering a decline. It depends what cars they are. People are always willing to pay for what they want and not what they don't want. It's quite common to hear people moaning about the cost of living and how bread has gone from £1 to £1.50, but can find about several £1,000s for a classic. That's quite common. People will pay for what they want to pay for in this world, and that won't change. And I think the 1945 to 1960 bracket is still it's a bit more healthier than pre-war stuff, but it's still going the same way because these are cars that still require a form of double declutching, etc. Have got interesting and weird controls, and unless you know somebody who currently owns one, you need a bit more knowledge than just a Haynes manual. If a Haynes manual covers them, Haynes manuals don't cover a lot of pre-60 stuff. You need the proper owner's manuals. So you'd have to do your research on whatever sort of pre-1960 car that you're looking at. But prices are pretty cheap for them for those reasons. But then they're going to probably continue to go down through the years. It depends what it is exactly. Anything from your 1960s to, I would say, 1980s. This is your, or say 1985 in this case. This is your creme de la creme of classic cars and motors. These are the motors that peaked about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or starting to go up massively 15 years ago. And they peaked probably 10 years ago, and now certain models are now certainly on the decline. Some never quite made it, P6s. I don't think I'd have owned my P6 if they hadn't been so cheap in the first place to acquire. And they've only really gone up a few thousand since I last sold mine. Unless it's a V8, in that case, the sky's the limit in some cases. But P6s are one of those classics that never really went up in value. People didn't really want to touch them. I suspect the over complexity puts a lot of people off from a DIY aspect. And as somebody who was far less experienced at working and doing DIY on his own cars, when I owned my P6, that's absolute goddamn rubbish. I think the only thing that is actually difficult is replacing the front springs, which can be done. It can be done, but you need to know what you're doing. And getting access to the rear brakes, which I was putting off myself. Those are the only two things on that car that really honestly look horrendously complicated. Everything else is there, you know, it's nuts and bolts, but like any classic, nuts and bolts can seize, snap, usual things that happen. So there's nothing out of the ordinary about them. But there are other classics of that age that haven't done very well. Mainly the BL staple. Unfortunately, BL bashing has not done them any favours back in the day, nor when there were second-hand cars, nor when there were classic cars. And yet people would happily throw money at the equivalent Ford. People would not pay for anything like an Austin Allegro, but would absolutely throw money at a Ford Escort Mark 1, Mark 2, like there's no tomorrow. I don't get that personally, because I don't think Escorts of that age are any nicer than anything of the BL staple. I think they're equally just as poorly built, especially in terms of rust and corrosion protection. Yeah. And on that line about Escorts especially, there are certain cars that have just, you know, have gone through oblivion, you know, in terms of their prices. And still today, people are pretty much spending money like there's no tomorrow on these cars. And the values have still maintained themselves. I don't think values for these cars are going up. I think they've sort of plateaued. I think the only cars that are really going through the roof that I've spotted in the auctions are fast Fords. Name me things like your sort of Sierra RS 500s, your Cosworths of the late 90s, Sapphire Cosworths I should say, anything like that, anything that's ridiculously fast and very niche and collectible as far as Fords are concerned. Yes, they're going through the roof. There's a couple of other makes and models. I mean, I still think that Jaguar E-Types are exactly where they were several years ago, and even more so in some cases, because you've got things like these Series 3 Jaguar E-Types that people used to look at and think, God, they're disgusting. They're nowhere. I mean, we can all agree that the Series 1 was the best one, and Series 2s are fine as well, but Series 3s were an acquired taste, but people have cottoned on to, oh, well, these are much more cheaper and accessible. So people have now started buying them, and therefore the demand has gone up, therefore the prices have gone up. So there is now no longer any Jaguar E-Type that is any more sort of affordable, accessible for people even who have a reasonable disposable income to throw at them. So that's another example. But there's an awful lot of cars that really suffer badly. And it's always, I'm afraid, sadly, the everyday cars. The cars that everybody used to drive, that you would see on every street corner, are the ones that are the poorest valued, and yet they are probably the rarest. A good example, actually, strangely, on another higher level, are Rover P6s. There were literally only a short amount of V8s ever produced, Rover 3500 and the 3500S, compared to the four-cylinder 2000 or 2.2, the 2000 or 2200. And now the roles have been reversed. There are now more V8s than the four cylinders, and I think that's appalling. There is nothing any beneficial to the Rover V8 P6s over the four cylinder. In fact, I really don't like the Rover V8 for many reasons. I don't think it's as good or as engineered as it should be. I think Rover didn't do as much as what people make it out to be. I think it's people who own them who really love them, and don't get me wrong, they sound nice. Don't sound as nice as the Triumph V8 that people bash as well, but they are fantastic burbly things, and they have done many years. I mean, they went for what is it, 30 odd years, maybe over 35 years in production, something like that. Absolutely ridiculous. And that was from Rover. That was before it sort of changed from being a Buick, but still, I think there were engines that Rover made that were much more their taste, and the four-cylinder was a great engine, and the inlet over exhaust 6 cylinders that you get in P4s and 5s, ridiculously good engines, even better. So yeah, Rover, you know, that's a good example of not an everyday car, but a more common car, and it's because people want the V8s more, and it's the same for everything else really. You know, your things like your Allegros, your Maestros, your Marinas, your Etals. I mean, Etals and Ambassadors are actually quite rare as well anyway. But these are staple cars. Escorts, common as muck, base Escorts, Very, very rare now. Yes, most of them are corroded, but most of them have been left to sort of fester a little bit in the last 15, 20 years, because these cars have been known as bona fide classics, at least for the last 10, 15 years, and yet still so many of them have gone the way of the wind in the last 10, 15 years, and it's because people don't want to put money into them. They would rather buy something that is more higher market and put money in where they think they're not going to lose. And I just think, to be honest with you, unless it's a really, if you buy an expensive fast Ford when they were cheap and now they've gone through the roof, well then you're not going to lose your money over a restoration. You probably made money if you're moving them on, but you can't make money on classics. It seems to be this wheeler dealer effect that you can make money on classics, or you can get your money back. I've heard that phrase before actually from Mike Brewer, and I think it's the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard. And it's, oh, you can buy this car really cheap, this car X, and then you can own it for a certain amount of years, spend a certain amount of money on it, and you'll be able to sell it for what you paid for it and get all your money back through what you've spent. I find that utterly hilarious, because where on earth does that happen now, or used to happen? Probably some very rare isolated cases like I've just explained, but no, you don't. You lose money on them. And people don't like putting money into things that they know, well, I'm not going to see that again. And I think people don't get the point in classic cars nowadays. It's all about what you can get, rather monetary-wise and value-wise, rather than actually, well, what you're getting emotionally and physically. And, you know, you're getting a car, you're getting experiences, you're buying nostalgia with some experiences and something that can move, hopefully. Rather than this sort of static museum collector sort of state that the car community is becoming slowly, where most people who've got anything of decent value doesn't really see the light of day apart from about 5 times a year. And it's actually not even driven half the time. Most of the time, these cars arrive to a show where they are apparently in a concourse competition on the back of a trailer. If I was a concourse judge and I saw that, I would disqualify that car immediately for the fact it never actually drove to the show. To qualify for concourse, it needs to look concourse and be driven, because I'm not being funny, concourse is a replication of what it was like when it was brand new. Well, I'm sure that manufacturers or dealers wouldn't have sold you a car that looks brand new, it's a brand new car, but can't drive. And I know there's some people that will probably do some British Leyland jokes there, but no, seriously, you could drive that car home, right? It was either delivered to you or you could pick it up and drive it away. Therefore, concourse cars on a trailer, no, disqualified. I don't get it personally, I never will. I like me everyday classics, something that you can relate to, you can just open the door, and it's lovely, me just going to do something on Ruby where it's a bit of cleaning or a bit of tinkering, and I'll just whip the car cover off, open the driver's door, wow, the smell, and I'll just stand there smelling the interior for a few seconds before proceeding with my job. That's just what classic cars do, and that's what you get. And I love the fact that car gives me that. I don't think I get it for many cars. So that's what it does. So that's that sort of section of cars. And now we've got you sort of, well, I would say 1985 to 1995 cars. So these are a bit weird because there's a lot of terminologies that go around modern classics as well, and young timer classics. I've heard that before. I personally think modern young timer classics should be between 95 and 2005. Because that's your up-and-coming cars. I'd say a lot of cars between 1985 and 95 they are classics. Ruby's a classic for that reason, but I have said in the past, and I do state this, if it's got a carburettor and a distributor, it's a classic. Not saying that it has to have that, but that's what I look for in a bona fide classic. And then obviously the 85 to 95 group of cars is a bit weird because you had all this change in technology. A lot of these are not viewed as classics, and you don't see many of this stuff in Matheson's car auctions or Anglia car auctions. You don't see much. You do see some, but It's very varied, it's very thin on the ground, and I think this generation are really going to be even thinner on the ground in the next 5 to 10 years, way before their time, considering a lot of factors. Mainly, they have at least 10, 15 years on the 1960 to 1985 generation of classics, but they're not in any better condition, to be honest. That could be the way that they were made, but also it's because people aren't putting money towards them. So this is a tricky age of car, and car values have plummeted right to the very bottom. There's certain cars of that age which are peaking, but most everyday stuff, Mark III Fiestas, they are not doing very well at the moment, and this is what is putting me off moving Ruby on. In fact, it's making me have a complete rethink about that car. What is the point in me selling a car for a few £1,000s? Because, I'm not being funny, I'd lose more than what I would gain in that circumstance. It really will feel like that. And I just think, at the moment, if anybody has a car around that sort of age of Ruby, and it's an everyday classic, that like a Vauxhall Nova, Fiesta, anything like that, an Escort, this stuff doesn't really do very well unless it's a fast version of that car and a sporty version. Even like, this is a gear Fiesta, for goodness sake, and they don't do very well. People don't want them. Even, shows like the Festival and the Unexceptional that has boosted the popularity of actually less equipment is actually more attractive. And we've seen examples sell for quite good money in the last few years, but now it seems to have taken a dive again, and people just don't want to pay any sort of money for these cars whatsoever. But that's fine. I'm happy with that as it is, but it's something I have to be very aware about. And this is what's stopping a lot of owners from spending money on their cars, especially if they pay mechanics to do mechanical jobs on them. And bodywork, well, that's just, that's another story, really. And where this whole episode is leading, I don't know where these values are going, but I am a bit concerned about it, because the more they start going down, I mean, Focus Mark 1s, I suspect that Focus Mark 1s will continue to just sort of plateau and just ease up a little bit, because I think people are recognising, finally, the classic status of this car, and where the values are going. And there's only one way, because there's not going to be many left. Not if my predictions are entirely correct, and I think they are. I won't be doing how many left on how many Mark 1s are remaining with us until another episode, which will be coming up soon. Then I can tell you exactly where they are continuing to head, and I can only assume down south in terms of numbers down south, but the values are going slightly north, but not completely north. So they will be strong. It's a Ford and it's a great car. That's great. That's two massive boxes. If it's a great car but it's not a Ford, it will still do well. If it's neither, it won't do very well. Not at this age. It has to be something really fast and sporty, like a Subaru Impreza of the same age. These hot rodded cars and these JDM cars, they're all very cut and thrust. And if you're in that sort of car community in itself, which is a kind of subculture, JDM, you'd be more versed on the values than I am on those cars, but I can imagine them being like that. But anyway, people will spend what they want to spend money on, but it's a bit of a warning to most people who want to dive into classics, that you have to purely do this for the love of the classic. You cannot go in there thinking, I'm going to try and be conservative and try and get most of my money back. We can all do that. We can all try to do that and be very careful, but ultimately what you pay the price for, and then all the costs to keep the car working properly, because what you don't want is to be in a situation where you've let the maintenance slip, and then suddenly something happens in your life, got to get rid of the car, and you have to let it go for stupid money, less than £1,000, because it's not working, doesn't have an MOT, it's got corrosion, etc., and because you've let things slip. So don't go into classics and kind of keep a lid on it, because you can't keep a lid on it. If you can't maintain the upkeep on a classic, you need to get rid of it as early as possible when it's working, when it has an MOT, because that's when they're valuable. When then nobody, as far as I'm concerned, if Ruby was a non-functioning car, let's say the gearbox packed up, and this is a real thing, and I've touched on this before with Ruby's gearbox. I have located a spare gearbox, fingers crossed. It's on my driveway soon, a low mileage one. But if the gearbox packed up and I was to say, do you know, let's say I didn't have the spare gearbox, that's a non-functioning car now. Now, what I would be forced to do is either try and find another automatic or manualise it, sadly. I would temporarily have to put a manual gearbox on just to get it running and then probably sell it. Now, in non-running condition, Ruby's not worth 800 quid. But if she's working, she's worth, you know, double, triple, quadruple that, okay? And that's the same with a lot of classics on that age. If it's running and it's working and you're not sure whether to keep it, I'd be very cautious about moving it on before things happen. And that's my advice there a little bit. But otherwise, you're going for the love of these cars and you don't count the pennies too much, because if you did, that is a problem for your mental health and for your bank account. So yes, go in for it, do your maths, and if you're not prepared to do that, don't buy a classic. Just be a spectator and enjoy looking at them at shows, but don't own one, because you're just going to go into a world of stress that you can't cope with. Anyway, I will leave this very random episode here, but yes, classic car values sort of mostly going down, some going up. Very varied. That's the world, isn't it? But at the moment, things are not looking great, so be wary. Take care, guys.